63% of the victims identified were 15 years old or younger. We're talking about babies.
And in every single data collection year, 2020, 21, and 2022, we had 10 and 11-year-old little girls that were targeted by traffickers. I think that speaks volumes to the work that needs to be done in how we approach our preventative efforts and how we educate our kids to keep our kids safe.
And statistics about human trafficking have always been difficult to accumulate or gather given the nature of the crime and it being very underreported. So we set out to gain an accurate picture of how trafficking presents itself in Mecklenburg County.
All rise.
All rise.
The Honorable Chief Justice and Associate
Justices of the Supreme
Court of Appeals of the State of North Carolina.
Yes, oh yes, oh yes. The Supreme Court of North
All
Carolina
of our citizens across the state depend upon us to uphold and protect both the spirit and the letter of the law, and to always apply the law fairly and impartially to every litigant who comes before this court.
God save the state and this honorable court.
Hello, my name is Nancy Hagan. I'm with the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission, and I welcome you to All Things Judicial, a podcast of the North Carolina Judicial Branch. Today we're talking about human trafficking, or the exploitation of people for labor services or commercial sex, which is a growing criminal enterprise. Reliable and timely data around cases of trafficking in the United States are limited, and this is due in part to barriers in data sharing among stakeholders. In North Carolina, we are fortunate to work with the Charlotte Metro Human Trafficking Task Force, who has recently released a report titled The Exploitation of Minors in the Queen City. They addressed the data gap by collecting information around cases of sexual exploitation of children in Mecklenburg County between January 2020 and December 2022. During that period, they identified a total of 170 unique minors who were suspected or confirmed as victims of human trafficking. Again, we are very pleased today to welcome 3 members of the task force as they discuss their findings. Our first guest is Shauna Pagano, who's the Director of Education and Community Engagement at Pat's Place Child Advocacy Center in Charlotte. Hello, Shauna, and welcome to All Things Judicial. Can you please give us an introduction to the work of the Charlotte Metro Task Force, in particular, the report that was recently compiled and presented?
I'm happy to do that, Nancy. Thank you for having me today. The Charlotte Metro Human Trafficking Task Force is a coalition of service providers, law enforcement agencies, and prosecutors, and we work together to address human trafficking in Mecklenburg County, which is Charlotte and the surrounding townships.
And how do you define human trafficking in your work?
So, the definition that's probably the, easiest to explain is one person who is compelling another person to perform labor services or commercial sex acts, and they're compelling them through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. For purposes of the report, we used the North Carolina definition of human trafficking.
And is there a distinction around the definition of human trafficking for adults and minors?
There is an important distinction in the definition for sex trafficking of minors. When there is sex trafficking of a minor, you do not have to prove that that child or teenager was compelled to engage in the sexual act using force, fraud, or coercion. Essentially, by engaging in a commercial sex act, which is a sexual act in exchange for anything of value, that child or teenager is automatically a victim of human trafficking. It is not legally possible for a child to be a prostitute or to prostitute themselves. That is a victim of sex trafficking.
Thank you for that clarification, Sean. I think that's a really important distinction to note, and one that many people may not be aware of. But I believe that distinction came into play in your work. You did, if I'm correct, focus on the exploitation of minors in the Queen City. Is that correct?
Yes. So we included any minor who is a victim of labor trafficking or sex trafficking, and we included incidents where there was not a facilitator or a trafficker, but an adult purchased sex directly from the minor.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit more as well about then the purpose of the research that you did and why you felt it was important to compile data around those kinds of incidences?
Absolutely. Like most people working in the anti-trafficking field, we wanted to understand the scope of trafficking. Statistics and data are important for a number of reasons, so that we can effectively provide services, identify gaps, and ultimately prevent the crime from occurring in the first place. And statistics about human trafficking have always been difficult to accumulate or gather given the nature of the crime and it being very underreported. So we set out to gain an accurate picture of how trafficking presents itself in Mecklenburg County.
And you decided to focus on minors initially.
Yes. From a logistical standpoint, it is easier to start with minors. State statute and our local administrative order allows for the sharing of information for minors who are being abused. But we do hope to collect data for adults moving forward.
And how did you collect the data then?
So we, the agencies in the task force that work with minors, compiled data about victims that they had worked with over the past 3 years. By working together, we were able to ensure that all of the data comprised unique cases and then removed any duplication. And we compiled the information, and then Present Age Ministries scrubbed all of the data. And we also took efforts to ensure victim privacy. And when we were communicating about the children, we used a unique identifier for an added layer of confidentiality. And obviously, the report is only in the aggregate. We would never identify, a child specifically.
And I believe that the data that was collected spans a period of 3 years from January 2020 to December 2022.
Yes, that is correct. It is 3 years of data.
And so the different members of the task force representing various agencies, including, for instance,
the agencies that collaborated were the Pat's Place Child Advocacy Center, Present Age Ministries, the Department of Social Services, the Police Department, and Atrium Health. We also collaborated with some other agencies from just a systemic standpoint, but the five I listed were the primary people who provided the data.
So really a wide array of service providers and stakeholders in the Charlotte metro area.
Yes, our goal was to make sure that anyone that was working with a victim of human trafficking would have the chance to contribute to this collaboration.
Sean, is there anything else you'd like to add about the report?
If you want to check it out, I know there's various ways that you can access it, but you can also check it out on our task force website, which is charlottehtTF.org. And please feel free to ask us or any of my colleagues who are also on this podcast if you have questions about anything that's found in the report.
Well, thank you very much for your work on the report, for your leadership with the task force, for your advocacy on behalf of minors who are trafficked and or vulnerable. We appreciate you very much participating in the podcast today, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Moving to our second guest, we welcome Hannah Arrowood, Executive Director of Present Age Ministries, to the podcast. Hannah, could you tell us a little bit about your work at Present Age Ministries and then how you came to be involved in the task force and this report?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you, Nancy. So Present Age Ministries is a 501c3 nonprofit committed to combating the sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking of specifically teen girls. And as you'll learn as we talk about the data, we know that 98% of the victims in this region are females, at least those that are identified. So Present Ages, our primary focus is those female adolescents, 17 years old and younger. And we work to provide intervention strategies as well as direct services and primary care for those that have been identified as victims of sex trafficking within the Charlotte region.
Thank you for that overview. Moving on to the report, what information did you collect and what were some of the conclusions that you came to with the data?
Yes, as a task force, we were really excited to compile this information. As we all know in this industry, in this field, information is so difficult to come by, concrete information. And one of the guiding principles for us during this project was, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And we really wanted to shift that narrative to one of facts and understanding to be able to create bridges to the community in ways and strategies to help shift the narrative. So one of the things that we found during this 3-year report covering periods January of 2020 to December of 2022 was that we identified 170 unique cases of suspected or confirmed trafficking cases of minors. This report was specific to those 17 years old or younger, and specifically within Mecklenburg County. We intentionally did a very targeted sector of what we were looking at so that we could get the rhythm of collecting data and information confirmed, smooth out all of the issues so that as we in the future broaden that scope, we will just have confidence in the way in which we are gathering information. But 170, those are ones that we identified. So we just also think, how many more are there out there that we haven't identified yet?
Those are really striking findings. And you said that they came from throughout the Mecklenburg County or particular to the Charlotte metro area. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the specific populations that you surveyed or encountered and where those folks were located and perhaps to their ages?
Absolutely, Nancy. So I'll give you really some very specific data points that we covered. We covered geographical location of the minor. We covered what was their age, and we also covered obviously what was their identified gender. And so if we break those down, we realized that within Mecklenburg County, 40 zip codes were impacted. And what that means is that we based it on the identification of the child's residence, not necessarily the location where trafficking occurred, because we didn't always have that concrete information, but 40 zip codes were impacted. And so it really just debunks the myth that it only happens in certain areas and it only happens in certain parts of town. Well, it actually covered almost 65% of the county was impacted by these cases of trafficking. And what we found that was, to me, one of the most beneficial pieces of information that we can use, not only to create strategies for prevention, but also to help us understand what resources do we actually need to have from a survivor standpoint based on development age of adolescence. 63% of the victims identified were 15 years old or younger. And so the average age being 14 years old. And so we really were just in awe, honestly, and in shock. I think we knew that's what we were going to discover, but to have it now in concrete evidence that we're talking about babies. And so how do we ensure that our services to those that are identified as a victim are, developmentally appropriate, are, gender specific, all of those things that are so critical to ensure that they get the trauma-informed services that they need, but also recognizing how you serve a 12-year-old is drastically different and looks very different than how you serve a 35-year-old. Yes, there are some clinical elements that might be the same, but just life is different, responsibilities are different. And so just having that information as an agency, but also as a task force, really helps us understand what we need to be talking about from a strategic standpoint to ensure that we're not only responding to the victims, but also what are we doing then about prevention? If the average age of identification is 14 years old, how early do we need to start these conversations to ensure that they aren't victims of trafficking in the first place? And those are some of the conversations that we're having as a task force to ensure that we can start to get ahead of this that's happening in our community.
So with that, what are some of your thoughts about how you will use this report and the findings moving forward?
Nancy, this might actually be my most favorite part. Data to just be data is really worthless unless we utilize it. And so for us as a task force, one of the things that we're specifically doing, as I mentioned, those 40 zip codes, there are some clear hotspots, as we call them, where we've identified the 5 most prevalent zip codes. And as a task force, we're now engaging to have community conversations within those areas. We're partnering with Mecklenburg County Parks and Rec Centers to host the events. We're contacting those schools. We're contacting those other local nonprofit agencies that are already working in those communities. We're contacting churches within those zip codes to point them to these community conversations where members of the task force, law enforcement, our healthcare providers, Department of Youth and Family Services, law enforcement will all be present. And we're going to just start having conversations about what we found, what they see, what are the needs that they have, how can we as a task force help, what is it that we don't know. I think it's also really important to address these conversations. While we have a level of expertise about trafficking, we're not experts in these people's lives, and we need to create a bridge to engage in those conversations. So we're really excited for February, March, and April to have this series of community conversations across our city. And then furthermore, one of the things that we really want to really focus and target on is our schools. We all know that there's Senate bill out there, 279, that requires the teaching of human trafficking in the health classes of 7th and 8th graders. But we really want to start to understand how that's being implemented at an individual school level, especially in those areas that we know have high rates of cases in trafficking, so that we can come along beside them as a task force and say, what do you guys need and how do we help you? We really want to get serious about the prevention of trafficking and interrupting that victimization of these kids versus just trying to make sure we can respond when it's identified. So it's a twofold. We're going to use the data to really do some community awareness and prevention. But then also, now that we know that there was 170 identified kids, do we have the capacity to really, if every one of those children were willing, because we all know that they're not willing to engage in services, but if they were, could we do it? And so now it really allows us to apply some systematic analysis of our services. That includes agencies like Present Age and others. Can we support this? And if not, how do we start to put resources behind it to make sure we can have the appropriate response when a child is identified?
So now you have the data that can inform a really multi-pronged and comprehensive approach to both, as you said, prevent and create awareness around human trafficking, and then serve the needs of not only the victims and survivors, but their families and communities. What would you say to other listeners or groups that may be interested in doing a similar sort of effort in their region?
If you're wanting to do something like this and you don't have those relationships, start building them, because that's really going to be the foundation of what you're able to accomplish. Trust is huge in this world. But I also would say is start doing it. Even if it's just your own agency. I can speak for myself as the director of Present Age. We started collecting data 5 years ago, and I had this dream that we would do this. But I also knew that we had to be doing it if was going to suggest that we should do it at a community level. So sometimes it's even just getting internal house in order to make sure you're in a place to do the things that need to be done at a larger scale level, at a community level, at a citywide level. And so making sure that you have the systems and the processes within your own agency to report that information consistently and accurately. So I think regardless of where a person is, regardless of where there's something that they can do to advocate on behalf of a community to ensure that collectively we can present a story that is accurate about what is happening to not only our kids, but just people in general when it comes to human trafficking.
Hannah, is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
I think the only thing that I would add is that if somebody out there has a desire to do this or wants to figure out how to take on a project like this in their city, in their community, we are more than willing to provide support, guidance, templates, process, any of that information that we've walked through over the last year. If it's helpful to you, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to have those conversations and provide that supporting documents and things of that nature.
We thank you very much for coming to speak with us today, and we appreciate all the hard work that you've done on behalf of the youth of Mecklenburg County. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, so much.
Next, we welcome Dr. Stacy Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role in the task force?
Sure, absolutely, Nancy. I would love to. By training, I'm an emergency physician and a pediatric emergency medicine subspecialist, and I serve on the board of directors of the Charlotte Metro Human Trafficking Task Force. I got introduced into this project that was led by Hannah because I'm also the medical director for the Atrium Health Human Trafficking Advocacy Team, which is a hospital-based response team dedicated to helping identify and serve potential victims in the healthcare setting.
And we've been talking with Shauna and Hannah about the study, its purpose, what some of the findings were, and now we'd like to ask you about what was learned. What are some of the data that you found most compelling in the work?
I think one of the things that was most striking for me is that 2/3 of our adolescent female sex trafficking victims were between the ages of 11 and 15 years old, so below the age of consent. And in every single data collection year, 2020, 21, and 2022, we had 10 and 11-year-old little girls that were targeted by traffickers. I think that speaks volumes to the work that needs to be done in how we approach our preventative efforts and how we educate our kids to keep our kids safe. Senate Bill 279 says that we need to be educating our kids about trafficking in the 7th and 8th grade. But I think this data really raises questions about, is that too late? And do we need to be starting at much younger ages to teach our kids how to be safer? Another thing that we noticed in the data is that all zip codes were affected. So there were no communities surrounding the greater Charlotte region that were safe from traffickers. All of our kids are vulnerable. And I think that's a message that we really want to get out to our community so that our community can be more proactive in protecting and anchoring its kids. One of the final things that really stood out to me that I think should inform our future work is that the parents were the guardians in the majority of the cases. So, when you stop and you reflect for a minute on the role of DSS in supporting these families and helping to protect children from this type of exploitation, I think that really causes us to take pause and think about, okay, well, what does this look like? What are we asking DSS to do? So I had looked on the North Carolina DHS website where it says that DSS's role is to promote the self-reliance and self-sufficiency of the family unit while preventing abuse, neglect, and exploitation of children. But, I really wonder, have we empowered DSS and given them the resources that they need to truly make our families self-sufficient and self-reliant in getting their children the help that they need to free them from this type of exploitation? I think most of us on our task force would probably say no, we haven't given DSS the right tools. And so I think that's an important partnership going forward that we can drive for change.
With that, we were wanting to ask you whether ACEs, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences tool or identifications, came into play. Was that something that you used when you conducted this study?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question, because we all know that complex trauma, pre-existing complex trauma, increases the vulnerability of children to traffickers. And we did not use the ACEs tool or an ACEs assessment in a structured way so far. We did try to do retrospective biopsies of the information that we had available from charts and from case discussions around various teams to get a sense of what levels of pre-existing ACEs we were seeing. I would say at this stage that data is pretty incomplete and already compelling. So what we learned just within our subset of adolescent minor sex trafficking victims that were treated through Atrium Health, 78% had documented sexual, physical, and or verbal abuse. And we did not have a complete data set or a complete biopsy on all cases. Further, we looked at, who is available to anchor these children, because we know the presence of a healthy anchoring adult in a child's life can make all the difference in making them resilient to trauma and helping them overcome whatever challenges their families have been faced with. And when we look at our data, 57% of our kids had suffered the traumatic loss of a parent. And when we define traumatic loss of an anchoring parent or grandparent, we stuck specifically to parents and grandparents that played active roles in those child's life. So if it was a single mom that was presenting as the guardian during the case, we did not make the assumption that dad was a lost guardian, unless the child truly talked about losing that parent along the way. 57% of our kids still felt like they had lost an anchoring parent or grandparent. And in 26% of the cases, we didn't have a complete data set to know for sure if the child had had that experience. And then among children who had an anchoring adult, 55% of them were in households where that anchoring adult was facing severe competing needs for their attention and energies. And we defined that as families where there were greater than 3 children in the home. There was a sick parent or grandparent that needed to be cared for. There were high levels of family conflict and or parents that were juggling multiple jobs to maintain financial footing for the family. And so, and some of our families, frankly, were dealing with all of those factors. So when you think about, what do we need to do to support these families and have a true 2-generational model of healing, that causes you to take pause, right? I mean, if we're asking a mom to participate in family therapy, we believe healing the family unit is critical to the success of these children to free themselves from exploitation and move forward with healthy lives. What are we willing to do to support the family financially and emotionally to make that a feasible solution? And, it's a complex problem that's not easy to solve, but I think exposing some of these realities gives us a chance to start looking for potential solutions.
Where are you all now with the work of the task force, and what will be your next steps? How will you implement this report?
One of our first steps is Hannah has organized some efforts for us to actually go out into the community with other task force members, law enforcement representation, and board members from our team to talk to the community about what we learned from this data and to help educate the community about some of what we know about kids at risk. And we're hoping that will inspire other folks in the community to step up and say, how do we make our community safer? How do we protect our kids? And for those kids that have been lost to exploitation, how do we come together as a community to recruit those kids back and help them become healthy, productive members of our communities and recover from what they've been put through in their experiences in trafficking?
Dr. Reynolds, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to get this information out there, and just to thank Chris's team for allowing us to be on the podcast. And then also just to say thank you to the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission for helping to get our team started. So, the funding that we had in the foundation grant that got this team off the ground was really the catalyst for this work. And so we just want to thank you for your leadership in helping to make the infrastructure in our state stronger.
For more information about the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission, please go to our website at htc.nccourts.gov. If you believe you are a victim or know a victim of human trafficking, there is help available. Please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-3737-888 or text Be Free. There is help available.